February 1st, 1943. 26,000 feet over Tunisia. The air at this altitude was not air. It was a thin, freezing poison that wanted to kill you. It was -40 degrees, cold enough to freeze sweat inside an oxygen mask, cold enough to jam a machine gun, cold enough to turn a man's lungs to ice if his supply line was cut. But inside the cockpit of the B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed the Broken Promise, sweat was pouring down Lieutenant Frank Pappy Miller's back. "Formation is tightening up," came the voice of the tail gunner, Sergeant Red O'Neill, over the interphone. His voice was tinny, distorted by the static and the roar of the 4 massive Wright Cyclone engines. "I count 30 bandits at 6 o'clock high. They're lining up." Frank gripped the yoke. His leather gloves creaked. "Stay sharp, boys. They're coming for the IP." The Broken Promise was part of a massive formation hitting the German supply docks at Bizerta. They were deep in enemy territory. The sky around them was a brilliant, deceptive blue, marred only by the ugly black smudges of flak explosions. Whump, whump, the plane shuddered. Flak. It was getting closer. "Navigator to pilot," came the voice from the nose. 2 minutes to target. "Open bomb bay doors." Frank reached down and flipped the toggle. A red light blinked on the dashboard. The belly of the beast was open. "Steady," Frank whispered. "Steady." To fly a B-17 in a combat box was an exercise in trust and terror. You had to fly straight and level so the bombardier could aim. You couldn't dodge the flak. You couldn't evade the fighters. You just had to sit there, a slow, fat aluminum goose, and take it. The swarm. Bandits diving. 12 o'clock. The screaming started. It wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of the top turret guns opening fire. The twin .50 caliber machine guns vibrated the entire airframe. Tat. Frank saw them. German Me-109s. They looked like angry hornets, yellow noses flashing in the sun. They were diving head-on, playing a game of chicken with a 30-ton bomber. Tracers zipped past the cockpit glass like glowing green fireflies. "They're targeting the lead ship." The co-pilot, Jim Tex Warren, yelled. Ahead of them, the lead B-17 Daisy May took a direct hit to the wing root. Fire blossomed, a terrible, silent orange flower. The wing folded up, and the plane spiraled down, spilling men and debris into the void. "God help him," Frank muttered. "Focus. Texas, keep her level." Bombs away. The ship jumped upward, relieved of 4,000 pounds of high explosives. "Close doors. Let's get the hell out of here." Frank banked the plane hard to the left, following the formation. They had dropped their load. Now they just had to survive the flight home. But the Luftwaffe wasn't done. The rogue. Bandit. 3 o'clock. He's coming in fast. Frank looked out the side window. A single Me-109 was cutting across the formation. He was erratic. Maybe he was damaged, maybe the pilot was dead at the stick, or maybe he was just insane. He wasn't firing. He was banking sharply, belly up, rolling out of control. "He's gonna hit us," Tex screamed. Time dilated. It slowed down to a crawl. Frank saw the rivets on the German plane. He saw the oil streak on the cowling. He saw the swastika on the tail. The fighter was hurtling directly toward the rear of the Broken Promise. "Dive!" Frank shoved the yoke forward. The huge bomber groaned, dipping its nose. It wasn't enough. The impact was not an explosion. It was a collision of physics and violence that defied description. Crunch screech. The sound was the shriek of tearing metal, loud enough to be heard over the engines. The entire B-17 whipped violently to the right, throwing Frank against the side of the cockpit. The instrument panel blurred. Maps, coffee thermoses, and dust flew into the air. The plane entered a violent spin. "Mayday! Mayday!" Frank wrestled with the yoke. Felt loose, sloppy in his hands. "We've been hit. Structural damage." He slammed the rudder pedals. Nothing. The pedals went to the floor. "I got no rudder," Frank roared. "Tex, help me with the throttles. Differential power." They slammed the left engines to idle and the right engines to full power. The asymmetric thrust fought against the spin. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose came around. The spinning stopped. The plane leveled out, shuddering like a dying animal. The silence. Sound off. Frank barked into the intercom. Crew check. Report. Nose crew okay. Top turret okay. Ball turret. I'm shaking, but I'm here. Waist gunners. We're okay, but there's a lot of wind back here, Skipper. Frank waited. Tail gunner? Red. Report. Static. Red. Talk to me. Nothing. Waist. Frank ordered. Go check on Red. Check the tail. There was a long pause. A pause that stretched for an eternity. Frank fought to keep the wings level. The plane wanted to roll over. Felt nose heavy and draggy, like it was towing a parachute. Then the waist gunner's voice came back. It was a whisper, choked with bile and horror. Skipper, you're not gonna believe this. Is Red alive? Yeah, he's alive. I can see him. He's waving at me. Then get him on the comms. I can't, Skipper. Why not? Because, the gunner stammered. I can't get to him. There's no floor. There's no fuselage. Frank felt a cold knot in his stomach. What do you mean? The fighter. It sliced us, Skipper. It went right through the tail section. The fuselage is cut almost all the way through. How bad? Skipper. The tail is held on by a few strips of metal. I can see the sky through the hole. The swinging back and forth. If we turn, it's gonna fall off. The diagnosis. Frank looked at Texas. Texas' face was white as a sheet. Take the controls, Frank said. Don't make any sudden moves. If you sneeze, we die. Frank unbuckled. He grabbed his portable oxygen bottle and scrambled out of his seat. He moved through the bomb bay, walking along the narrow catwalk over the empty darkness. He reached the waist section. The wind was howling, a hurricane of freezing air blasting through the ship. He looked aft. He grabbed a strut to stop his knees from buckling. The waist gunner hadn't exaggerated. The German fighter had acted like a giant meat cleaver. It had smashed into the fuselage just behind the waist gunner's windows and just forward of the tail wheel. The entire rear of the plane, the vertical stabilizer, the horizontal stabilizers, the tail gunner's compartment was detached. Almost. It was hanging by a shred of aluminum skin on the bottom and one twisted longeron beam on the top. A gaping hole, 4 feet wide, separated the main cabin from the tail. Through the hole, Frank could see the clouds rushing by below. And inside the severed tail section, trapped in his little glass cage, was Sergeant Red O'Neill. Red looked back at Frank across the gap. He was trapped on an island of metal, dragging behind the plane like a tin can tied to a wedding car. Red tapped his headset. He pointed to the wires. The intercom cables had been severed. The tail section swayed. It moved 3 feet to the left, then 3 feet to the right. It groaned. Creak. Groan. The metal strip holding it together was tearing. The impossible math. Frank scrambled back to the cockpit. He strapped in. Well? Tex asked. How bad? It's gone, Texas. The tail is gone. It's just following us out of habit. Frank looked at the altimeter. 20,000 feet. They were still over enemy territory. We have to bail out, Tex said. We have to jump. Frank looked at the instruments. We can't, Frank said. What? Why not? The parachutes for the rear crew are stored near the main door. That's right next to the brake. If they try to move to get them, the weight shift will snap the tail off. Red is trapped in the back. He can't get out. If the tail snaps, he falls without a chute. And the rest of us? If we jump, Frank said, his voice hard. The change in pressure when the hatches open might tear the fuselage apart. And if that tail comes off while we're jumping, it'll smash into the elevators. We'll spin in before we clear the doors. Tex stared at him. So we're trapped? We're riding a corpse. We fly it home, Frank said. We fly it gently. Frank, look at the wing. Frank looked to his left. He had been so focused on the tail he hadn't checked the primary damage. The collision hadn't just hit the fuselage. The German fighter's wing had clipped the B-17's left wingtip. About 10 feet of the left wing was missing. Just gone. The aileron, the control surface that allowed them to bank, was hanging by a cable, flapping uselessly in the wind. So, Frank summarized, we have no rudder. We have half a left wing. We have no left aileron. And our tail is held on by spit and a prayer. And, Tex added, pointing to the fuel gauge, we're losing gas. That hit must have cracked a line. Frank gripped the yoke. He tried to feel the plane. Felt mushy, unstable. It wanted to porpoise, nose up, nose down. Don't climb, Frank whispered to the machine. Don't dive. Just glide. The predators. Skipper. The top turret gunner called out. I got 2 bandits. 6 o'clock high. They're circling back. The German fighters had seen the cripple. They smelled blood. Usually, a B-17 is a fortress. It has interlocking fields of fire. But the broken promise was defenseless. The tail gunner was cut off. The ball turret was jammed. The waist gunners couldn't fire without vibrating the fuselage apart. They're coming in for a finish, the gunner said. Frank watched the fighters. They were lining up for a coup de grace, an execution shot. Hold your fire, Frank ordered. Don't shoot unless they're right on top of us. The recoil will snap the tail. You want us to let them shoot us? I want us to stay in the air. The lead me 109 Dove. He came in slow, arrogant. He knew the bomber was dead. He wanted to save ammo. He drifted alongside the B-17, just out of range, inspecting the damage. The German pilot flew close. Frank could see his face. He was wearing goggles. The German stared at the gaping hole in the fuselage. He stared at the tail swinging in the wind. He stared at the missing wingtip. He must have been an engineer, or maybe just a man who respected the laws of physics. Because he stared for a long time. Then he did something incredible. He shook his head. He tapped his temple with his gloved finger. Crazy. He didn't fire. Maybe he thought they were already dead. Maybe he thought wasting a bullet on a ghost wasn't worth it. Or maybe, just maybe, he couldn't bring himself to kill something that refused to die so stubbornly. The German pilot saluted. A crisp, respectful salute. Then he peeled off and banked away, taking his wingman with him. He let us go, Tex breathed. He actually let us go. He thinks we're crashing, Frank said grimly. He doesn't want to waste the film. He's going home to report a kill. Frank looked ahead. The Mediterranean Sea was a blue strip in the distance. Home base was 300 miles away. All right, Frank said. We're alive. Now comes the hard part. What's the hard part? Turning, Frank said. We have to turn 90 degrees to head for the base. If I bank the wings, the tail falls off. If I use the rudder, the tail falls off. So how do we turn? Frank looked at the engines. We use the throttles. And we pray. February 1st, 1943. Over the Mediterranean Sea. Easing power on 1 and 2. Increasing power on 3 and 4. Frank Miller's hands were gentle, like a safecracker feeling for tumblers. He wasn't flying a bomber anymore. He was balancing a house of cards in a windstorm. The B-17 responded with the grace of a brick. With the left engines idling and the right engines roaring, the plane began a slow, shuddering skid to the left. It wasn't a bank. It was a flat yaw, the nose dragging across the horizon. Watch the tail, Frank yelled. It's swinging. The waist gunner screamed over the wind noise. It's moving about a foot to the right. The crack is opening up. Frank held his breath. If the tail swung too far, the airflow would catch the vertical stabilizer broadside and rip it clean off. Come on, baby, Frank whispered. Hold together. Just a little more. The compass slowly ticked around. South, southwest, west. They were pointed home. Frank neutralized the throttles. The plane settled, but the vibration remained. A constant, teeth-rattling shimmy that ran up through the floorboards and into Frank's spine. The slack. Altitude check, Tex said. His voice was tight. 15,000 feet. We lost 5,000 in the turn. We're descending too fast, Frank. Pull her up. Frank pulled back on the yoke. Nothing happened. The yoke moved freely back toward his chest, but the nose of the plane didn't rise. It kept dipping, aiming for the whitecaps of the Mediterranean below. "I got no elevator," Frank said, cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "The stick is dead." "Did the cables snap?" Frank pulled again. He felt resistance at the very end of the travel, but it wasn't enough. "No," Frank realized with horror. "The cables didn't snap. They're loose." The fuselage was broken. The structural damage had caused the entire airframe to sag and bend in the middle. The distance between the cockpit and the tail had shortened by a fraction of an inch as the metal buckled, or perhaps the tail was drooping, creating slack in the steel control cables that ran along the roof of the fuselage. Without tension, the cables couldn't pull the elevators up. "We're going in," Tex said, watching the altimeter unwind. 14,000. 13,000. "I need tension." Frank unbuckled his harness again. "Tex, keep her steady. Do not touch the pitch." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to fix the damn plane." "The human turnbuckle." Frank scrambled out of the cockpit. He grabbed the flight engineer, Sergeant Kowalski, who was manning the top turret. "Kowalski, get down here." Kowalski dropped out of the turret. "Skipper, the elevator cables are slack. The plane is bending. We have no pitch control." Frank dragged Kowalski through the bomb bay. The wind was deafening. They reached the radio room, then the waist section. The damage was terrifying close up. The fuselage looked like a crushed soda can. The roof was buckled. The floor was split. And through the gap, they could see the severed tail section bobbing up and down. "Look!" Frank pointed to the ceiling of the fuselage. The thick steel cables that controlled the elevators were sagging. They hung down like clotheslines. "We need to tighten them," Frank yelled. "If we don't, we can't pull the nose up." "How?" Kowalski shouted. "We don't have tools for that." Frank grabbed the cables with his bare hands. He pulled down on them. The tension increased. At the front of the plane, the nose rose slightly. "That's it," Frank yelled. "We have to pull the slack out manually." "I got it, Skipper." Kowalski was a big man, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh. He reached up and grabbed the two greasy steel cables. He wrapped them around his gloved hands. He pulled down with his body weight. The cables tightened. "Go back and fly," Kowalski roared. "I'll hold it." The descent. Frank ran back to the cockpit. He strapped in. "Pull up," Frank ordered. He pulled the yoke. This time he felt resistance. Kowalski was back there, hanging off the cables, acting as a human tensioner. The nose of the B-17 rose. The descent slowed. "It's working," Tex cheered. "We're level at 10,000. "Get on the interphone," Frank ordered. "Talk to Kowalski. He's our elevator trim now." Tex keyed the mic. "Kowalski, how you doing back there?" "Heavy." Kowalski's voice grunted. "Tell the skipper to stop jerking the stick. My arms are being ripped off." "Smooth inputs only," Frank said to himself. "Fly it with your fingertips." They were flying a wreckage. The pilot moved the stick, which pulled the cable, which was being held tight by a man in the fuselage, which moved the elevator on a tail that was barely attached. It was a Rube Goldberg machine of survival. The passenger. In the severed tail, Sergeant Red O'Neill was freezing to death. The heating system had been severed along with the intercom. The temperature was 20 below zero. He was curled up in a ball on the floor of his compartment, away from the open hole where the wind screamed. He watched the main plane. He could see the waist gunners looking at him. One of them, a kid named Baker, held up a thermos of coffee and shook it, asking if Red wanted some. It was a dark joke. There was no way to pass it across the 4-foot gap of rushing air. Red looked down at his parachute. It was right there, clipped to the wall. He could put it on. He could roll out the back. But he knew what Frank had said before the intercom cut. If the weight shifts, the tail snaps. Red was 180 pounds. If he moved to the escape hatch, the center of gravity of the detached tail section would shift. The torque would twist the single metal beam holding him to the plane. He would fall, and the sudden snap might tear the rest of the tail off, sending the B-17 into a dive that would kill everyone else. Red O'Neill made a choice. He sat back down in his seat. He strapped himself in. He looked at Baker across the gap. He gave a thumbs up.
I'm staying.
The storm. Weather ahead, Tex warned. They were approaching the coast of Algeria. The boundary between the cold sea air and the warm desert air created a wall of turbulence. Huge towering cumulus clouds. We can't go around, Frank said. We don't have the fuel. And we can't go over. Kowalski can't hold the cables for a climb. So we go through? We go through. The B-17 hit the turbulence like a car hitting a brick wall. Wham! The plane dropped 500 feet in a second. In the waist, Kowalski was lifted off his feet. He hung from the cables, his boots kicking the air. He didn't let go. If he let go, the nose would drop and they would dive into the sea. Hold on! Kowalski screamed, his muscles tearing. The tail section whipped violently. Crack! A loud snap echoed through the ship. We lost a strut, Baker yelled from the waist. The top longeron is gone. It's just the skin holding it now. Frank fought the controls. The missing wingtip made the turbulence worse. The plane wanted to roll upside down. Frank had to use full strength on the yoke just to keep the wings level. We're losing altitude, Tex yelled. 5,000 feet. 4,000. I can't pull up. Frank gritted his teeth. If I pull too hard, the tail comes off. They were caught in a deadly trap. They needed to pull up to stop the dive, but pulling up put stress on the tail. They had to surf the descent. Lower, Frank said. Let it settle. 3,000 feet. 2,000 feet. The whitecaps of the waves were huge now. Kowalski, Frank yelled into the intercom. Give me everything you got. Pull. In the back, Kowalski wrapped the cables around his elbows. He braced his feet against a bulkhead. He roared, pulling with every ounce of strength in his body. The elevators bit into the air. The nose leveled out. They bottomed out at 800 feet. They were under the clouds. The turbulence smoothed out.
Jesus Tex Echaled.
That was close. The approach. Field in sight. Ahead, the desert coastline appeared. And there, a strip of brown dirt. The airfield. They see us, Tex said. I see flares. They're clearing the runway. Frank looked at the fuel gauges. Empty. They were running on fumes. Gear down, Frank ordered. Tex reached for the lever. Wait, Frank said. If we drop the gear, the drag might snap the tail. The sudden jolt. If we don't drop the gear, we belly in, Tex argued. A belly landing will definitely snap the tail. Red will be crushed. Frank rubbed his eyes. There was no good option. We dropped them late, Frank said. Last second. Minimize the drag time. Flaps. No flaps, Frank said. Flaps change the pitch too much. We come in hot. Hot. Tex looked at him. Frank, with no flaps and that missing wing, our stall speed is going to be 140. We're going to hit that runway like a rocket. I know. The final mile. The runway rushed toward them. It looked impossibly short. 1,000 feet, Tex called out. Speed 160. Kowalski, Frank said. Get ready. When I say flare, you pull those cables until they break. We need the nose up for landing. Roger, skipper. Baker, Frank called the waist gunner. Tell Red to brace himself. Put pillows, blankets, whatever you have around the brake. If that tail comes off on impact, he knows, skipper. He's braced. 500 feet. The plane was bucking. The aerodynamic drag from the missing wingtip was fighting them. Gear down. Tex threw the lever. Thunk. Thunk. The main wheels dropped. The drag hit them. The tail groaned. Steady. Frank lined up the runway. He was coming in fast. Too fast. 200 feet. Speed 150. Cut engines. Tex killed the mixtures. The props windmilled. The roar died, replaced by the whistle of the wind. Now they were a glider. A broken, heavy glider. Flare! Frank screamed. In the back, Kowalski threw his weight backward. He pulled the cables down to his waist. The nose rose. The wheels reached for the dirt. Frank held his breath. If they hit too hard, The tail would snap off, tumble forward, and crush the cockpit. If they hit too soft, they would run out of runway and hit the ravine at the end. The ground rushed up to meet them. Part 3. The miracle on the dirt. The touchdown. The desert floor blurred beneath them, a smear of brown and yellow. "Hold it off! Hold it off!" Frank whispered through gritted teeth. He was fighting the ground effect. The B-17 wanted to float, but with the missing wingtip, it wanted to roll to the left and cartwheel into a fireball. Frank stood on the right rudder pedal, which was useless, and jammed the yoke hard right. Screech. The right main will hit first. A puff of blue smoke. The plane slewed violently. Then the left will hit. Bang! The impact was harder than Frank wanted. 140 miles per hour on dirt. The B-17 bounced, rattling like a tin can full of bolts. In the fuselage, Kowalski was thrown against the bulkhead. He lost his grip on the elevator cables. "Lost it!" Kowalski screamed. With the tension gone, the elevators flopped uselessly in the wind. The tail lost its aerodynamic lift instantly. Gravity took over. The snap. It happened in slow motion. Frank felt the nose slam down onto the runway. The tail, heavy and unsupported, dropped. Crack krrrrunch. The sound was sickening. It was the sound of a spine breaking. The single metal beam holding the tail section finally gave up. The aluminum skin tore like paper. The tail section, with Sergeant Red O'Neill inside, broke off completely. "The tail is gone," Tex yelled. "We lost the tail." Frank didn't look back. He couldn't. He was fighting a 30-ton sled that was careening down the runway at 100 miles per hour with no brakes and no rudder. He slammed on the toe brakes. Hiss-pop. The left brake line blew out. The plane swerved violently to the right, toward the tents of the ground crew. "Kill the master switch," Frank roared. "Cut the electrics." Tex killed the power to prevent a spark. Behind them, a nightmare was unfolding. The main fuselage was skidding through the dust, kicking up a massive cloud. And behind it, tumbling end over end like a discarded toy, was the tail section. It bounced, rolled, and scraped along the dirt, throwing up sparks as it chased the plane that had birthed it. The ravine. The end of the runway was coming up fast. Beyond it was a dry riverbed, a ravine 20 feet deep. If they went over the edge, the fuselage would break its back, and the fuel tanks would rupture. Frank stomped on the remaining right brake. The plane spun. It drifted sideways, the tires furrowing deep trenches in the hard-packed earth. The dust cloud swallowed the cockpit. Frank couldn't see anything. He just felt the G-forces pulling him sideways. The plane shuddered. It groaned. And then, with a final lurch, it stopped. Silence. No engine roar. No wind. Just the ticking of cooling metal and the sound of Tex's heavy breathing. Frank opened his eyes. The dust was settling. The nose of the B-17 was hanging 5 feet over the edge of the ravine. "Everyone out!" Frank shouted. "Move! She might blow!" The reckoning. They scrambled out of the emergency hatches. They jumped onto the dirt, coughing in the dust. Frank didn't run away from the plane. He ran back. He ran past the waist gunners, who were stumbling out of the side hatch, pale and shaking. He ran past Kowalski, who was cradling his bleeding arms. He ran to the debris field behind the plane. About 200 yards back, a crumpled heap of aluminum lay in the dirt. It looked like a crushed soda can. The vertical stabilizer was bent at a 90-degree angle. Frank reached the wreckage first. "Red!" he screamed. "Red!" He tore at the twisted metal with his bare hands. He ripped away a panel of skin. Inside, the tail gunner's compartment was a wreck. The glass was shattered. The seat was torn loose. Red O'Neill was upside down, strapped into his seat, which was wedged against the ammo box. He wasn't moving. "Medic!" Frank yelled. "Get a medic over here!" Frank reached in and touched Red's neck. Red's eyes snapped open. "Skipper!" Red rasped. Frank let out a laugh that sounded like a sob. "I'm here, Red. I'm here." "Did we land?" Red asked, looking around at the wreckage. "Or am I dead?" "We landed," Frank said. "Technically." Red tried to move. He winced. I think I broke my leg. And I think I wet my pants, Skipper. That's allowed. Red? Frank smiled, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. That's allowed. The unbelievable. By sunset, a crowd had gathered. Pilots from other squadrons, mechanics, and the base commander walked around the broken promise. They stood in silence, hats in hands, staring at the impossible machine. They looked at the left wing with 10 feet sheared off. They looked at the fuselage held together by luck and willpower. They looked at the severed tail sitting 200 yards away. A colonel approached Frank, who was sitting on an oil drum, drinking a canteen of water. "Lieutenant Miller," the colonel said. He sounded dazed. "My engineers just looked at the plane." "Yes, sir." "They said it's aerodynamically impossible for that aircraft to fly. They said the drag coefficient alone should have put you in a flat spin. They said without the rudder and elevator cables, you had zero control authority." Frank looked at Kowalski, who was having his arms bandaged by a nurse nearby. "We had control, sir," Frank said. "We improvised." The colonel shook his head. "I'm putting you and your crew in for the Distinguished Flying Cross. But I have to ask, how did you keep it level?" Frank thought about the German fighter pilot, the one who had saluted him, the one who had seen that the plane was dead, but refused to kill it. "I don't know, Colonel," Frank said softly. "Maybe the plane just didn't know it was dead yet." Epilogue: The Ghost. The broken promise never flew again. It was dragged to the boneyard at the edge of the field and stripped for parts. But the legend remained. New crews coming into the theater were taken to the boneyard. They were shown the fuselage. They were shown the severed tail. "You see that?" the veterans would say. "That's what a fortress can take. That's what brings you home." Frank Miller survived the war. He flew 25 more missions. He went home, married, and opened a hardware store in Ohio. He never talked much about the war. But every year on February 1st, he would go into his garage. He would open a small wooden box. Inside was a piece of jagged aluminum, painted olive drab. A piece of the tail of the broken promise. He would hold it for a moment, remembering the cold, the wind, and the sound of Kowalski groaning on the cables. He would remember the impossible landing. And he would whisper the same thing he whispered that day on the runway. "Good girl. You got us home." The end.